Greetings! I am Shad. Sorry, couldn't resist. Teleport! Okay, let's really get to the subject of this video. Names of swords. Now, in the past, I have said, and indeed I'm not the only one who has said this, that the most common type of name that was used to call different types of sword was just, it's a sword. Whether it's two-handed, one-handed, single-edged, double-edged, it would just be like, that's a sword. And the concept of more specific names, like arming sword, long sword, great sword, falchion, that those terms are more modern inventions used to satisfy the incessant need we have in the modern day to categorize everything. And this term kind of comes from historical sources. And so one of the things is that sometimes you'll read or find the term longsword in historical documents referring to different types of swords because the terms are a bit more loose, like same with rapier. And this leads us to the conclusion that specific names for swords is a more modern notion, and in their historical context, swords were more often just referred to as swords. I have said this myself, indeed I say it in my video where I talk about sword names, classifications and terminology and stuff, so I'm as guilty as anyone for being of this opinion. But as I think about this further, pure logic leads me to a different conclusion. And this isn't to say that the conclusion that we've just come to, that swords were just called swords in their historical context, that's not to say that that idea isn't incorrect, but I feel it's an oversimplification. Why is it an oversimplification? Well, I shall demonstrate. The practice of just calling any type of sword a sword isn't something that we stopped doing. We still do it to this day, but there's a circumstance when we would do it and when we wouldn't. Let me show you. I'm going to call you Squire.
Squire?
Yeah, Squire is someone who helps out a knight. And so Daddy's going to pretend to be a knight and you're going to be his squire. Okay? Squire? Can you please go get me my sword? Thank you, Squire. You did a wonderful job. Alright, let's try this another way. Squire, can you please go get me my sword? Thank you. You did a wonderful job. So, it was a simple enough concept that a child can understand it. I didn't need to identify which type of sword because there was only one sword to pick from, not counting all the ones that are strewn on the floor in front of me. But let's see how far this simple understanding can be taken. Squire, can you please pass me my sword? Thank you, Squire. You did a wonderful job. Excuse me, little Squire. Can you please pass me my sword? Can you please pass me my sword? Ta? Ta for Daddy? Okay, this one might be a little too young. Okay, so it was quite obvious. Because there was only one sword, I didn't need to say or refer to that sword by any other name other than sword. And I think that's what we really mean when we say a sword is just called a sword. But as soon as you add more than one, so more than one type of sword, there's going to need to be a different term so you know which one you're talking about. Squire, will you please get me my sword? That is the wrong sword. That is also the wrong sword. Well done, thank you. That's the one I wanted in the first place. Don't worry, it's completely blunt and not even real steel. So clearly, as soon as we have more than one type of sword, we would need a way to differentiate one between the other. A couple of caveats that, of course, need to be mentioned, which are quite obvious. First one is that in the modern day, we have far more swords from different parts of history and different cultures that now it is far more necessary to have terms to differentiate one from another just for clarity's sake, to avoid confusion. But that's not to say that in history there weren't different types of swords that would have been there at the same time. But granted, of course, we have more now today, which is why there's a greater need for a list of names for each sword. And the other kind of obvious point that I will mention is that you probably didn't need a specific name to help define the difference between the two types of swords that you might have come across. Like, pass me the big sword, pass me the small sword, pass me the one-handed sword, pass me the colourful sword. So it only takes one additional descriptive kind of phrase to let the person know what sword you're talking about. But if you didn't have anything visual to reference, you would then have to go into more explanation. Well, he was using a sword his handle was big enough for two hands, the crossguard was decently bigger, the pommel was round, the blade, it was actually a thick, big bladed weapon as well. Of course, that could all be avoided if the person just knew what a big longsword was. And sometimes they're called war swords, like just the big bladed types. And again, there probably wasn't much of a need to have terms referring to different types of swords, because a person in their life, like an average soldier or whatever, probably would only own one sword at a time, and so he would never need another term on top of sword to help others know what he's talking about. My sword. Can you go grab my sword, love? Sure thing, love. But even with those things mentioned, I still feel that there would have been eventually a couple of terms that just would have caught on amongst the group or people you associated with. And those would have been the terms they used. And whatever they were, because we don't really know what they were now compared to then. So a sword would never really have just been a sword when you needed to refer to a different type of sword over another one in whatever context where you're talking to someone else, when it was important or easier just to refer to without having to explain the exact type of sword, just call it its name. So then, why don't we know these terms? And better yet, why do we have different terms referring to the same type of sword from historical contexts? Well, I have an opinion, it's a theory, it's nothing proven, but my theory would be this, is that the world was a much smaller place. They didn't have a thing called the internet, that when something was named something, everyone could look it up and find out the right name. They just had to call whatever they thought it made sense to them, and that most likely would have been different to the people in another city a couple of 100 miles over there, because it's not like someone is going to trudge all those miles over there and say, oh, just to let you know, this type of sword, it's a long sword, alright? Problem solved. Everyone got that? Good, I'm off. No, so they might have called it a great sword, perhaps, or a two-handed sword, or big sword, or war sword. There's a whole heap of names that you could call this sword. That one, the long sword. And most likely, each individual community of sword-using peoples, whatever, probably had their own set of terms that they used to refer to different types of swords, and if they did happen to spread a bit, well, it wouldn't have spread much. So, were swords just called swords in history? Yeah, of course they were, but that doesn't mean they weren't called something else when you needed to define one sword over another. And that's my point. I just took a really long roundabout way to explain it because that's what I do! I'm an idiot! And this is why, in some historical documents, we have more than one name for a certain type of sword. Because different communities would have had different names. Not because I'm an idiot. I didn't even exist back then, so my idiocy couldn't have affected them. Unless it's so great that it can actually overcome space and time.
And one final point that I wanted to make, just because the different types of swords were called different names in the past than what we call them now, that doesn't invalidate the names that we have developed in the modern day to differentiate between the different sword types. Now, why do I say this? Well, I've actually come across people when, a discussion is being thrown about in regards to the terms and names of swords, comments arise saying, well, they weren't even really called those terms in history, they were just called swords, so there's really no point in using specific terms to define different swords. I think that is a stupid comment, in all honesty. Of course there is a need to have specific names to define the different types of swords, for the very reasons that I have explained. I actually feel that they are just as valid and legitimate as the terms that would have been used in the past, because they serve the exact same purpose, as long as there is an understanding between people that when you say a certain term, they then know what sword you're referring to, it is legitimate. Now, I personally prefer names and terms that do not create confusion, but it really does seem that it would just take too much work to replace them. If the terms do eventually change to better ones, I'm all on board with that, but it doesn't mean that the current terms don't do the job. They do.
Thanks for watching. I hope you'll have fun thinking about the things that I've shared, and until next time, farewell! I don't know why I'm saluting. Eddie, can you grab that for Daddy? Ta for Daddy? Like, so Daddy has it? So, yay, I got the sword. So, ta for Daddy? You just want to come here. Is that better?